But with Nicola Sturgeon suggesting we could have masks for many years to come, should we accept that face coverings are now part of daily life? Should governments consider having mandates every winter to ward off cases of colds and flu, as well as COVID, and to keep us prepared for any future pandemic? Or are masks an environmental hazard with unconvincing scientific merit who should be consigned to the dustbin of history? Well, what do you think? Let me know your thoughts. Mark at gbnews.uk. We'll bring my brilliant panel in shortly, but to debate this first off, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Gary Sidley, a former NHS consultant clinical psychologist and a member of the HEART Group, a group of academics and other experts who look at the impact of COVID measures on public health, society and the economy. I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Sally Ann Cutler, who is a professor in medical microbiology at the School of Health, Sport and Bioscience at the University of East London. Brilliant to have both of you with me. Professor Cutler, can I ask you whether you think we should have face masks forever?
No, I don't think we do, because basically we've needed to have the mask mandate to try and reduce community transmission. We don't know quite how successful that is because people wore their masks in different ways. Not everybody wore them across their nose and mouth. And the quality of masks is very variable as well. So to get precise data on the efficacy of the mask wearing is quite difficult to actually ascertain. But also, you can see that in some cultures, mask wearing has actually become integrated into part of the normal culture. If you look at countries like Japan, for instance, it's quite common to see people mask wearing before we even had the COVID pandemic. And this is in response to the first SARS outbreak that happened quite a few years back now. And so they started mask wearing in public spaces, and that's carried on and it's become normalized. But personally, I don't think we need to continue mask wearing once community transmission drops down to manageable levels, more acceptable levels. We've got to decide what an acceptable level of community transmission actually is, though.
But why do we worry about community transmission of Omicron, which by all accounts is a very mild virus, Professor Cutler?
And yet people are still dying. And so it's
and
not
people die of the flu. People die of the flu every year. And there is a significant social and economic downside to these face coverings, as well as an environmental one.
I think the downside to the face coverings is not particularly large. Certainly communication can be a little bit impaired if you're wearing a face mask, but it's still possible. But basically, I think going back to what you said about Omicron being less severe, you can't really compare Omicron directly to the other variants quite as basically as that, in the fact that you're now looking at a population that has largely been vaccinated and that has largely been exposed to SARS-CoV-2 in its previous forms, some of the other variants. And so we built up a degree of immunity, which is why the severity of the infection appears to be milder in our population now. So this is part of the natural building up of immunity.
Wait, is Omicron milder because people have had COVID already, or is it not just a milder variant, as the South Africans told us in November of last year?
But you're looking in a population now that has already seen SARS-CoV-2 before in its previous forms. And a lot of the population, certainly in the UK, have now been vaccinated. A lot of the population in South Africa, their vaccination rate is only sort of like, I think...
under 30%. Under 30%. Yeah, about 25%, yeah.
Good, but many of them had actually had previous infection with Delta and also some of the previous variants as well. So a lot of them had actually had natural infection as opposed to vaccination. So again, giving them that degree of immunity. So you're not looking at a naive population. And so the fact that you've seen Omicron transmitting around the world, it's not actually been transmitting in a totally naive population. The first variants of SARS-CoV-2 that we saw, then we did have a naive population. It's before we were vaccinated. And that's why we saw such massive hospitalizations and those alarming casualties, which was really sort of dramatic, terrifying, and that's why a lot of people are so fearful of actually becoming infected with COVID.
Well, that's a very interesting response, Professor Cutler. Dr. Sidley, masks are a low-level restriction and a price worth paying to reduce transmission of a virus which is still killing and hospitalising people.
Well, I fundamentally disagree. I think there are three reasons why I believe masks are the most insidious of all the restrictions that have been imposed. Firstly, it's ineffective. The evidence that masks actually reduce viral transmission is weak and inconsistent, and the more robust randomised controlled trials tend to conclude that it does not make any significant difference on respiratory virus transmission. Second, and I disagree with my fellow panellists here, is that there are a range of negatives associated with masking healthy people. There are physical negatives, headaches, exhaustion, skin conditions, increased risks of falls in the elderly. A lot of evidence for that, just to name but a few. But even more importantly, there are social and psychological harms to our society. From a psychological point of view, masks are a very potent maintainer of fear. And we know fear has been artificially elevated throughout the pandemic, and masks are now acting to keep that fear level going. And excessive fear in a community does have costs, including making a significant contribution to the tens of thousands of non-COVID excess deaths that we've seen throughout the pandemic, with people being too scared to go into hospitals, elderly people dying of loneliness in isolation. Fear elevation is not good for our society. Then we've got all the social harms. It stymies human interaction. There's some evidence it impedes the development of our children, cognitive, social and emotional development. And also, just to name one more negative, and that is the impact on people who have suffered historic abuse. There's lots of people in our society who have suffered sexual and physical abuse in the past that has often involved hands over the mouth or suffocation, or indeed the assailant being masked. And now just the sight of masked people in society, let alone having the somatic sensation of cloth over the face, really triggers some extreme emotional reactions. And if you doubt that, I'd suggest you have a read at our smilefree.org website, SmileFree being the campaign to get rid of mask mandates, where there's about 24 personal testimonies from people who've really suffered from the mask mandates because of their historical abuse. The third thing, and this is the insidious bit about it, I think, is that it seems that the most likely reason that mask mandates have been introduced in the first place was as a compliance device. If you actually explore what happened in 2020, when we had all the public health preparations carefully planned, definitely saying, no, absolutely not, we shouldn't be masking healthy people, it will do more harm than good. And then around early summer 2020, they all flipped. Jenny Harris, Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance, Jason Leach in Scotland, the World Health Organization flipped and did a huge U-turn. And that wasn't in response to any emerging new robust evidence that masks were effective. So you're left to ask the question, well, what possibly could it be? And we look for clues in what was happening there. And just to give a few circumstantial bits of evidence, Deborah Cohen, a very respected BBC Newsnight reporter at the time, was informed that political lobbying was the reason why the WHO changed its mind on this. And when she put that suggestion directly to the WHO, they did not reject it. They did not deny it. Also, we've got Gavin Morgan's testimony. Gavin Morgan is an educational psychologist who sits on the SPIB, the behavioural science subgroup of SAGE. And in Laura Dodsworth's excellent book, A State of Fear, she interviewed him. And he said he was very much against masking, particularly masking kids. But there were people on the committee who believed it was a good idea because it promoted a sense of solidarity. Now, that's not got much to do with viral transmission, as far as I can see. And finally,
go on then.
Can I just say, just on this last point, Mark, if I may,
sure.
It's that also, if you actually look at what we've had to endure over the last 2 years with the issue of psychological nudging to get us to comply, the three most prominent psychological nudges that have been deployed on the people of our country are fear inflation, shaming, and peer pressure as scapegoating. And I don't think it's any coincidence that masks enforce and enhance each of those three nudges in a big way. They're fear perpetuators because it screams at us that one of us is a biohazard. Maybe both of us are a biohazard. It maintains fear. It easily allows people to be identified so that people can tell who's following the rules and who isn't. So it kind of harnesses peer pressure and scapegoating. And also because of the ego nudge about equating following the rules with being a good, virtuous person. You remember the actor with things like, I wear a face covering to protect my mates, all that kind of thing. Really very effective, very powerful. It's equated following the rules with being a good person. And the flip side of that, of course, is you're a bad person if you don't. And masks are so easy to distinguish the good guys from the bad guys. So it's a really potent compliance device. And unless someone could come up with a better explanation as to why we flipped back in June 2020, I think it's the most plausible explanation there is.
Gary, very briefly, if you can, because I'll come back to Professor Cutler. If face masks reduce transmission even by a small percentage point and save a few lives, it's got to be worth it, hasn't it?
Well, as I said, I don't think there's any evidence that they do, but I'm not sure even if it was the case that if it kind of helped around the edges, given the pretty severe negative consequences, physical, social, psychological, and I haven't even got onto the environmental, which with all this waste that we see in our streets, to actually mandate something, Mark, the evidential bar would need to be very, very high. And so it would have to be really emphatic that there was lots of benefits, that it saved lots of lives to actually justify any mandate. And I don't think we're there yet.
Isn't that the problem, Professor Cutler, that if you're going to mandate a measure like face coverings, the burden of proof is on the person mandating them? And the science around face coverings is flaky at best. I, for example, have spoken to the former SAGE advisor, Dr. Colin Axon, who told me on this programme that face coverings are a complete waste of time and that the holes in a face mask are either 1,000 or 5,000 times larger than the virus itself. If we take a look, and I believe that my producer Joe's got this photograph taken earlier today by Dr. Amir Khan on Twitter. It was mentioned in my big opinion monologue, and Amir Khan is a GP, I'm sure a very good doctor and a good man. But he's tweeted, on the train to London, still wearing my mask, thinking of those more vulnerable than myself. And he's wearing what's called a surgical mask. Now, these masks, Professor Cutler, are not accepted, for example, in Germany or Austria. So what's the point?
Well, this is exactly what I said at the beginning, that there are many different types of masks and they're different quality, different grades. You've got the ones that the people in the NHS are wearing, which are higher grade, higher specification. You've got the cloth ones, you've got triple layer, you've got single layer, and then you've got the way that people actually wear the masks. And so a lot of people, when we've had mask mandates, have still got their nose poking over the top of the mask and things like that, which is not wearing the masks correctly. If you've got
this is an NHS GP. I mean, the vast majority, Professor Cutler, of face coverings in this country are either the surgical masks, which are not accepted in Austria or Germany. They argue that they're ineffective. And then we have the other types of masks, which are the cloth masks, which the chief medical advisor to CNN in America has said are completely useless. She called them facial decorations. So the cloth masks don't work. The surgical masks don't work. This is a non-starter, isn't it?
There are different levels, and some of the cloth ones are just single layer, some are triple layer. Obviously, triple layer is better, but it's going to inhibit your breathing that much more. The higher the grade of mask, the better the degree of protection, the more uncomfortable it is going to be to wear as well.
And therefore potentially harmful.
Sorry?
Potentially harmful, therefore. I mean, is it optimum for human health to cover our faces, Sally Ann Cutler? Is it optimum for human health to wear a mask for 8 or 10 hours? Go on.
I'm Sally Jane, by the way, not Sally Ann.
Oh, can I apologise for that? I'm so sorry.
Okay, not a problem. But basically, there are many different types of masks and many different ways that people have actually worn their masks. A lot of people are wearing their mask under their chin, not even covering their mouth and nose. But I'm actually not saying that we need a mandate forever and a day. I agree that we should actually move away from the mask wearing. But it's just, while we've got very high community transmission, mask wearing is one of the measures, along with the whole suite of other measures, that actually help to reduce community transmission. And so when you've got very high community transmission, you need to instigate these measures to try and reduce it. One of the fear factors that you mentioned actually sort of earlier is the fact that people feel sort of that it's making them very conscious, very health conscious, very worried about that. But also the positive that you get from that is people actually wash their hands that much better. And think of all the other infectious diseases that we've actually reduced transmission of through people actually washing their hands properly and basic hygiene measures like that. So that's been one of the positives that we've actually had from the pandemic. And so I think people have become more health conscious. But I agree, we need to move away from that as the levels of transmission are dropping down. So I think then we can say, okay, we don't need to mask wear as a mandated thing. But I still personally feel that if I'm in a confined space for a prolonged period of time with a lot of other people, I still feel, well, we've got 90,000 new cases per day at the moment in the UK. I feel more comfortable actually having people wearing masks around me and for myself to wear a mask as well. So that's why we've got quite high transmission still. I work in a university. We've got a lot of people that have just flown in from other countries that I've never met before. I'm in confined spaces with them for hours on end. And I feel more comfortable actually wearing a mask.